There's a quiet moment that comes after the last workday. No more meetings, no more deadlines, no more rushing out the door with keys in one hand and coffee in the other. At first, it feels like freedom, like the opening of a long-awaited chapter where every morning feels like Saturday and your time finally belongs to you. But then, something unexpected creeps in. Not loudly, not all at once. It starts in the silence. The stillness of a quiet morning when the phone doesn't ring. The late afternoon sun stretching across the living room as you sit alone, wondering who you used to be before all the titles, before the world needed you. That's the weight no one warns you about. Retirement doesn't just take away work, it strips away the rhythm of life you've known for decades. It removes structure, identity, purpose, and yes, even distractions. So what do most people do when that silence becomes heavy? They fill it. They call old friends. They drop by houses. They plan endless visits, meetups, gatherings, because being alone feels unnatural. And in that moment, we confuse activity with well-being, busyness with connection, and visiting friends too often with healing. But what if I told you that all that socializing, however well-intended, might actually be wearing you down, not lifting you up? Because here's a truth few are brave enough to admit. After a certain age, not every type of connection nourishes us. Some drain us, some distract us, some delay the deeper work of understanding who we've become. It's a hard truth, especially when we've been told our whole lives that staying social is the key to happiness in old age. But wisdom isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers. And today, it's whispering something many won't want to hear. You might need to stop visiting your friends so often after retirement. Not because they're bad, not because you don't love them, but because there's something in you that needs more attention right now than their stories, their energy, their homes. That someone is you. Now, before you dismiss this as loneliness turned bitter or some cold philosophy of isolation, let's walk this path together, step by step. You'll hear stories, real ones, of people who tried to stay endlessly social and ended up more exhausted than fulfilled. Of elderly men and women who discovered a deeper sense of peace, not from being with more people, but from being more whole in themselves. And as we go, I'll show you the 5 hidden reasons why too much visiting might be quietly hurting your health, your spirit, and your ability to grow in this final, most beautiful stage of life. So if you've ever felt tired after a day of fun, if you've ever come home from a visit and asked yourself, why do I still feel so empty? If you've been afraid to slow down, sit still, or just be with yourself, you're not alone, and you're not broken. You might just be on the edge of a breakthrough, a new kind of freedom, the kind that doesn't come from full calendars and endless company, but from depth, presence, and clarity. Let's begin. Some people think loneliness comes from being alone, but in truth, loneliness often hides in the middle of a crowded room. You laugh, you nod, you listen to another story you've heard 10 times before, and still, something inside you doesn't feel seen, doesn't feel fed. It's strange, isn't it? You thought retirement would bring rest, more time with friends, more time to laugh, but instead you find yourself drained. Not just tired, but emotionally wrung out, as if every visit pulls a little more from your well without ever filling it back up. It's not that your friends are bad people. They mean well. They care. But as we grow older, the kind of energy we give and the kind we need begins to shift. When you were younger, maybe you could spend all day at a friend's house and feel refreshed. Now it's different. Now you come home and it feels like you left parts of yourself behind, scattered in conversations that didn't really matter. And as night falls, the silence feels heavier, not because no one's there, but because you were never really with yourself to begin with. Let me say something that may surprise you. Emotional exhaustion doesn't always come from stress. Sometimes it comes from overconnection, from being constantly available, from absorbing everyone else's stories, moods, opinions without boundaries. And retired people were especially vulnerable Because with more free time comes the silent expectation to always be available, to say yes, to never turn down a visit, to always be on. But no one talks about the emotional price of always being on. You see, every human being has an inner cup, a cup of patience, of attention, of presence. When we were younger, we could refill that cup quickly, just sleep a little, go for a walk, have some coffee. But now that cup refills more slowly and empties more easily. And every visit, no matter how well-meaning, draws from it. The talking, the listening, the pretending you're not tired, the smiling when you'd rather rest, the polite laughter, the emotional work of holding space for others. That work is invisible, but it's real. And over time, it builds up. Not in your calendar, but in your body. Your blood pressure rises, your sleep becomes lighter, your mind feels cloudy, you get irritable even with yourself. And one day you wonder, why do I feel so empty even though I've been around people all week? Here's why. You've been giving energy without receiving rest. You've been socializing out of habit, not out of joy. And that, my friend, is emotional exhaustion. It creeps in quietly like a fog. You don't see it until you can't see yourself anymore. But here's the truth no one teaches us. Rest isn't just about doing nothing. It's about choosing stillness over noise. It's about understanding that you don't have to be available all the time to be loved. You don't have to attend every gathering. You don't have to return every call right away. You don't have to smile when your soul is asking for solitude. You see, emotional exhaustion is your spirit asking you to come home, not to a place, but to yourself. And sometimes the most generous thing you can do for you and for others is to say no, to stay in, to be alone without being lonely. That's not selfish, that's sacred, because healing begins where the noise ends. And once you reclaim that space, you'll notice something remarkable. You begin to feel full again, not from others but from within. There was a time when solitude was considered a virtue, a noble path. Saints, philosophers, poets, they all sought silence not because they feared people, but because they longed for clarity. But somewhere along the way, we forgot. We began to equate being alone with being unloved. We filled every quiet moment with noise. The radio, the television, a lunch date, a phone call, another friendly visit we didn't really want, but felt too polite to refuse. We feared that if the room ever grew truly silent, we might not like the person sitting in it. But what if solitude isn't something to escape from? What if it's something to return to? You see, after retirement, there's a sacred window of opportunity. A space opens, time softens. The world steps back and says, you no longer belong to the rush. What will you do with your stillness? Most people rush to fill that gap with social plans, as if solitude is a void that must be covered. But the wise ones, they do something different. They sit with it, and that's when something remarkable begins to unfold. You start to hear things you haven't heard in years, the true tone of your breath, the rhythm of your heartbeat, the quiet desires buried beneath decades of obligations, the questions you never had time to ask. Who am I now that no one needs me to be anything? That's not an easy question. It can feel scary, but it's also the beginning of reconnection, not with the world but with yourself. You see, when you're constantly surrounded by people, you begin to mirror their thoughts, their emotions, their opinions. It's subtle, but over time it becomes hard to tell which voice is truly yours. But solitude hands you back your voice, your rhythm, your truth. In the stillness, you remember what excites you, not what used to, but what still does. You remember how to listen, not to others, but to your inner wisdom. And perhaps most beautiful of all, you begin to feel whole, even when no one's around to see it. The world tells us we must stay social to stay sane, but it forgets that solitude is not the absence of sanity, it is the restoration of it. Let me tell you something few will say out loud. Solitude is not punishment, it is medicine. It is where we find our dignity again, where we process the decades we've lived, where we make peace with our regrets and offer grace to our younger selves. And it is in this quiet space that we often find what no crowd can give us. The deep, steady sense that we are enough, not because someone says so, but because we've felt it in the marrow of our being. So if you feel the urge to fill every hour with a visit, a chat, a distraction, pause, ask yourself, when was the last time I kept myself company, not out of loneliness but out of love? You may find that the person you've been running from is the very soul you've longed to meet again. Let's be honest, it starts innocently. A friend drops by once or twice a week after you retire. You enjoy the company, the laughter, the stories, the break from the quiet house. Soon it becomes routine. You start looking forward to it. Then you start depending on it. And before you realize it, your day feels empty if no one shows up. Your emotions hinge on someone else's arrival. And what used to be a pleasant visit becomes a silent expectation, a lifeline, a crutch. But here's the hard truth no one warns you about. When we rely too much on others for stimulation, connection, or validation, we slowly forget how to walk on our own. We tell ourselves it's just socializing, that it's good to stay connected. And it is, until it starts masking something deeper, avoidance. Avoidance of quiet, of self-reflection, of that growing discomfort that whispers, if no one calls today, do I still feel like myself? Dependency is a strange thing. It doesn't always look like leaning. Sometimes it looks like overscheduling, like needing constant companionship just to feel balanced, like calling someone not because you want to talk, but because silence feels unbearable. And that's where it becomes dangerous, because when the visits stop, when friends get busy, or illness strikes, or the world shifts, suddenly the silence isn't just silence. It's panic, it's withdrawal, and you realize something uncomfortable. You haven't been building strength, you've been borrowing it. But life after retirement was never meant to be lived through the lives of others. It was meant to be a rediscovery of your own depth, your own breath, your own backbone. If you find yourself anxious when alone, ask, have I forgotten how to comfort myself? Am I filling my days with others to avoid facing what's inside me? This is not about isolation. It's about reclaiming sovereignty over your emotional world, because the danger isn't just dependency. It's what happens to your sense of identity when the support is gone. The visits, the phone calls, the friendly lunches, they should be gifts, not necessities. Supplements, not survival tools. Remember, true connection begins within. When you learn to enjoy your own company again, every interaction becomes richer, not because you need it, but because you choose it. You don't have to cut ties, you don't have to become a recluse, but you do have to ask, am I standing on my own soul, or am I leaning on borrowed shoulders? Rebuilding that inner strength won't be easy, but it will be worth it. Because one day, when the room is quiet, and no one is coming by, you'll sit back, smile gently, and think, this piece is mine. I didn't borrow it, I earned it. There's a subtle trade that happens in our later years. One so quiet, we barely notice it. It begins with a simple choice. Go for a walk or have tea with a friend. Read a book that challenges your thinking or talk about the neighbor's dog again. Prepare a nourishing meal or join the group for cookies and gossip. At first, these moments feel harmless. But over time, something troubling begins to unfold. You start putting your growth on hold just to stay socially comfortable. And that's when the self, the deep, wise, evolving self, begins to fade quietly into the background. We think we're choosing connection, but sometimes we're actually choosing stagnation. Because real growth, it requires time alone. It asks for discipline. It demands that we sit with discomfort, stretch our limits, and sometimes say no to easy pleasures for the sake of something greater. But when your calendar fills up with visits, when your energy is spent pleasing others, you stop asking yourself the questions that matter. Have I moved today? Have I hydrated well? Have I fed my mind anything deeper than idle chatter? Have I spent even 10 minutes tuning into what I feel, not what others feel? You see, comfort can be a beautiful thing, until it becomes a cage. It can keep you from the very habits that strengthen your body, sharpen your mind, and enrich your soul. I've met so many elders who once had dreams of learning the piano after retirement, of finally taking care of their health, of writing their memoirs. But instead, they spent every morning hosting friends, and every evening too tired to do what truly mattered to them. And here's the secret no one tells you. Not every lovely afternoon leads to a fulfilling life. Sometimes, the nicest people around you can become the greatest distractions from your potential. Yes, there is joy in companionship, but there is also power in protecting your sacred energy. Your muscles don't care how charming your visitor was. They only care if you moved. Your brain doesn't stay sharp through small talk. It sharpens through challenge, reflection, and learning. And your spirit, it can't grow if it's always being shaped to fit into everyone else's schedule. So ask yourself, gently but honestly, am I tending to my body, mind, and soul? Or am I outsourcing my aliveness to the comfort of company? If your health is declining, if your dreams are collecting dust, if your days feel full but your heart feels flat, then maybe, just maybe, you've been giving too much of yourself away, one polite cup of coffee at a time. But here's the beauty of later life. It's not too late. You can begin today. You can choose one moment of stillness, one stretch, one page, one boundary, and in that choice, you begin to reclaim the self you've long neglected, not out of selfishness, but out of reverence, because you, my friend, were never meant to fade politely into other people's calendars. You were meant to bloom, even now, especially now. But first, you must stop abandoning yourself for the comfort of being liked. Imagine waking up one day and not quite recognizing who you've become, not because you changed overnight, but because you slowly got lost in the noise, the endless chatter of other people's expectations, opinions, and needs. After retirement, many find themselves swept into a sea of social obligations. The visits, the phone calls, the constant desire to be present for others. All noble in intention, but often quietly consuming. And here's the invisible danger. As you give yourself away, piece by piece, to the rhythms of others, your own voice begins to fade. You start living for their schedules, their stories, their comfort. And in the process, your own identity, the person you once knew, loved, and dreamed with, begins to erode. This isn't just about being busy. It's about losing the very sense of who you are beneath all the noise. Your passions might grow dimmer. Your opinions might soften just to keep peace. Your desires might seem less important than the next invitation or phone call. And so, the question becomes, who are you when the crowd fades away? If you're not careful, the answer might surprise you. Because sometimes, after years of bending and giving, we discover we don't know ourselves anymore. But here's the truth that can save you. Your identity is not a fixed thing. It can be rediscovered, reclaimed, even rebuilt. It starts with small moments. A quiet morning without a visitor. A journal entry that isn't meant for anyone but you. A hobby picked up simply because it sparks joy. These moments are acts of resistance against erosion. They remind you that you are more than the sum of your social circles, more than someone's friend, neighbor, or company. You are a person with stories that no one else can tell, with dreams still alive under the surface, with wisdom that deserves to be heard first and foremost by yourself. If you catch yourself blending too much into the background, if you feel a creeping sense of invisibility, it's time to pause, because losing yourself in others is the quietest form of loneliness. And after a lifetime of giving, you deserve to know the joy of simply being, not just being seen, but being truly you. There's a profound beauty in stepping back, in creating what I like to call a sacred distance, a gentle space between yourself and the world around you. It's not about pushing people away, not about loneliness or isolation. It's about choosing quality over quantity, meaningful presence over endless presence. When you embrace this sacred distance, something remarkable happens. You begin to see your relationships with fresh eyes. You cherish moments of connection more deeply, because they are no longer expected, they are chosen. You reclaim your time, your energy, and your sense of self. And in that freedom, you find joy that no crowded room can offer. Think about it. When you say no to visits that drain you, you say yes to moments that nourish you. When you protect your inner peace, you invite others to meet you on your terms, in your full, authentic presence. This is the freedom of retirement, not a slowing down, but a turning inward to what truly matters, a chance to cultivate your own rhythm, your own pace, to listen deeply to the quiet voice that has been waiting all along. And here's the secret. The less you give yourself away to meaningless noise, the more abundant your life becomes, not just in days or hours, but in meaning, vitality, and peace. So as you move forward, remember this: it's okay to say no. It's okay to choose yourself first, because your truest gift to those around you is the whole, vibrant, rested you. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If this message resonates with you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring the wisdom of aging together. Remember, your story is powerful, and your life is worth living fully on your terms.